I want you to imagine, just for a moment, a city. And uh, this city is built right in the middle of a massive floodplain.
Okay, a floodplain.
Yeah. And over the decades, the water level in this floodplain starts to rise, just slowly but completely relentlessly. Now, when the first few houses on the very edges start to flood, it's a tragedy for those specific families, sure. But it's really easy for everyone else who's living on higher ground to just blame the homeowners.
Right, they point fingers.
Exactly. You hear people say, well, they should have built higher foundations, or they should be out there bailing the water out faster. It's framed as a failure of their own home maintenance. But then the water just keeps rising, and suddenly half the entire city is underwater.
The whole system is swamped.
Right. The downtown financial district is flooded, the elementary schools are flooded. And at that point, any rational observer has to admit that we are no longer looking at a sudden collective collapse of individual willpower.
No, of course not.
We are looking at an environment that has fundamentally changed. The infrastructure, the dam, the very ecosystem has failed.
And that framework, it's non-negotiable if we are going to actually tackle the global obesity epidemic, because what you're describing isn't just a metaphor for a natural disaster. It is the exact overarching conceptual model we have to use.
Right.
We have to use it to understand why populations across the entire globe are gaining mass at this unprecedented rate. It's an environmental and systemic failure. It's not, an epidemic of sudden moral failing.
And to figure out how to actually fix this floodplain, we've pulled together the research, the clinical data, and the public health frameworks from Chapter 8.4 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health.
Which is incredibly dense, but so vital.
Oh, it's massive.
Yeah.
But our mission for this deep dive is to move completely beyond that tired, honestly, scientifically illiterate, eat less, move more mantra.
Please, please.
We are going to build clear conceptual frameworks. We'll trace the path from environmental exposure straight through to the biological outcomes at the cellular level, then the system-wide economic impacts, and finally,
to the upstream structural interventions that actually work.
Exactly. And whether you are a medical student prepping for boards, or a junior doctor seeing patients on the ward, or maybe a public health trainee looking at these massive population-level data sets, this companion deep dive is designed specifically to strengthen your clinical reasoning.
Because the goal here isn't just to memorize a list of alarming statistics. Anyone can look up numbers. The goal is to develop that systems thinking muscle. We're looking at one of the defining public health crises of the 21st century.
We want to understand the actual mechanisms, the really complex interactions of genetics, epigenetics, economics, and biology that create what we call the obesogenic environment.
Obesogenic environment, exactly.
So let's start right at the foundation. How do we even measure the scope of this problem? Which brings us to the body mass index, or BMI.
BMI.
Right, because if you walk into literally any clinic in the world, BMI is treated as this ultimate, unassailable medical tool. But the history of BMI is actually quite surprising. It wasn't developed by physicians trying to measure the burden of disease, was it?
No, not at all. The origins of BMI actually trace back to the actuaries at the United States Metropolitan Life Insurance Company.
Wait, life insurance actuaries?
Yeah, well before the Second World War. They weren't doctors trying to, optimize health or measure morbidity, which is the burden of chronic illness. They were purely mathematicians trying to analyze mortality.
You just wanted to know when people were going to die.
Exactly. Their sole objective was to figure out the statistical probabilities of when people would die so they could price life insurance premiums appropriately.
That distinction feels incredibly important. They were looking at mortality death rates, not morbidity, which is the actual disability and disease you carry while you are still alive.
It is a vital differentiation for public health. We have to separate hazard from risk. A hazard is the potential to cause harm like the biological stress of excess mass, while risk is the statistical probability of a specific outcome, like death, actually occurring.
All right, okay.
So fast forward to 1995, and the World Health Organization formally adopts BMI cutoffs as the global standard. They set 18.5 as the lower limit for normal weight. They set 25 as the threshold for overweight and 30 as the threshold for clinical obesity.
But getting the medical community to actually agree on those numbers was notoriously difficult, right?
Sure.
Because early observational studies presented a deeply confusing statistical picture.
Oh, it was a mess. They consistently showed what epidemiologists call a J-shaped curve for mortality.
Okay, let me visualize that for a second. A J-shaped curve means the people at the very low end of the BMI scale, like the absolute thinnest people, were dying early.
Right, that's the short hook of the J.
Then the risk of death dips down to a healthy, safe low in the middle of the weight spectrum. And then, as weight increases into the obese categories, the risk of death shoots sharply back up, forming the long stem of the J.
That is correct. And for a long time, researchers interpreted that short hook of the J to mean that being a little bit overweight was actually biologically protective.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, there have even been recurrent, highly publicized analyses out of the US suggesting that being in the overweight category might be advantageous for maximum life expectancy.
But those findings completely neglected some massive population-level confounding factors, didn't they?
Absolutely massive. Specifically, smokers and people experiencing unintentional weight loss due to severe undiagnosed illnesses.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that confounding,
Mm.
because this is crucial for clinical reasoning. If a patient has, say, undiagnosed pancreatic cancer or severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, they might lose a massive amount of weight in the 1 to 5 years right before they die. So when the researchers take a snapshot of the population for a study, that dying patient gets categorized in the low BMI group. But they aren't dying because they have a low BMI. The low BMI is just a symptom of the underlying pathology that is actively killing them.
Right. That is the textbook definition of reverse causality. The disease caused the weight loss didn't cause the death.
And smoking does something very similar, right?
Very similar. Nicotine is a potent appetite suppressant, so smokers tend to have lower body weights across the board. But they also have vastly higher mortality rates from cardiovascular disease and lung cancer.
So if you don't aggressively control for those factors, your data makes it look like being thin is incredibly dangerous.
Precisely. To get an accurate picture of what excess mass actually does to the human body, researchers had to scrub the data. They discarded the first 3 to 5 years of follow-up data entirely to exclude all those early deaths from pre-existing conditions, and they strictly separated out the smokers.
And what happens to that protective J-shaped curve when you finally strip away the smokers and the undiagnosed cancers?
The J-shape just vanishes. The data then consistently overwhelmingly suggests that for non-smokers in a Western environment, the lowest mortality actually sits at a BMI of 22.5 to 25.
Okay.
Furthermore, the optimal population mean BMI, meaning the average weight for an entire society where you minimize the risk of weight-related chronic diseases while simultaneously minimizing the risk of undernutrition, is roughly 21.0.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate here. If we look at those WHO cutoffs,
Yeah.
the progressive health hazards don't just magically switch on the moment a patient crosses a BMI of exactly 25.
No, biology doesn't work in hard lines.
Right. If you look at the classic comorbidities, type 2 diabetes, essential hypertension, gallstones, coronary heart disease, the risk for those conditions actually scales linearly, starting from a BMI nadir of about 19 or 20.
It does.
So isn't setting the normal upper limit all the way at 24.9 actually quite generous? Aren't we effectively ignoring a massive amount of morbidity and physical disability that accumulates long before a patient ever crosses that arbitrary line into overweight?
I mean, that is a highly astute clinical observation. From a strict biological public health perspective, the choice of 24.9 as a definitive cutoff is somewhat arbitrary and, frankly, arguably lenient.
Yeah.
The physiological hazards of carrying excess mass are absolutely progressive. For a non-smoking individual, the optimum life expectancy and, crucially, the maximum disability-free life is actually achieved if their BMI remains around 20 to 22 throughout their entire adult life.
Wow.
But here is the fundamental flaw of BMI. It is simply a proxy for generalized mass. It tells us you have extra tissue, but it is completely blind to where that mass is biologically located.
Ah, okay.
And that leads us to a much more sensitive and much more dangerous metric, the geography of fat.
The geography of fat, so where the adipose tissue is physically stored, matters just as much, if not more, than the total volume of fat. Which brings us to the Interheart study. This completely shifted how we think about cardiovascular risk.
It did. The Interheart International Case Control Study was a monumental piece of epidemiological research. It looked at acute myocardial infarctions, heart attacks, across 52 countries.
52 countries.
Yes, representing every major ethnic group on the planet. And what it proved definitively is that your waist-to-hip ratio is a far more sensitive and universally applicable measure of cardiovascular risk than BMI could ever be.
Because biologically speaking, all fat is not created equal.
Far from it. We have to draw a stark biological line between peripheral fat and visceral fat.
Unpack that for us.
So fat deposited peripherally, like the subcutaneous adipose tissue on the hips and thighs, is actually surprisingly protective from a metabolic standpoint.
Protective, really.
Yes. It is a safe, relatively inert storage depot. But visceral fat, the intra-abdominal fat that packs itself deep inside the abdominal cavity, literally wrapping around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, that tissue is highly pathogenic. It actively drives metabolic dysfunction.
I always try to visualize this like a manufacturing plant. Storing your extra raw materials in the warehouse out back, that's your subcutaneous hip fat. It's safe, it's out of the way, it doesn't bother anyone.
That's a great way to look at it.
But abdominal, visceral fat is like storing hazardous, highly reactive chemicals directly inside the main control room of the factory. It doesn't just sit there. It leaks onto the control panels. It actively interferes with the actual operations of the machinery.
That analogy perfectly captures the pathophysiology. Visceral fat isn't just a passive storage bin. It is a highly active endocrine organ.
An organ?
Yes, it secretes inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and interleukin-6 directly into the portal vein. And the portal vein flows straight to the liver.
Oh, wow. So it's just dumping inflammation right into the liver?
Exactly. This causes acute hepatic insulin resistance, pushing the liver to pump out more glucose and triglycerides. It is the absolute core driver of the metabolic syndrome. Now, clinically, while the waist-to-hip ratio is highly accurate for measuring this specific hazard, simple waist circumference, just measuring the waist alone, is globally preferred by public health authorities.
Why would we prefer simple waist circumference if the waist-to-hip ratio is slightly more sensitive in the data?
It really comes down to clinical pragmatism and cultural sensitivity.
Cultural sensitivity.
Yes. First, it doesn't require calculating a ratio, making it a single concrete number that is much simpler for patients to track and for primary care teams to record. But second, and very importantly from a global health perspective, it avoids the need to physically measure the hip circumference. Right. In many conservative societies around the world, asking a patient to submit to a hip measurement is culturally problematic. It's highly sensitive, and it requires female physicians to take considerable care. Waist circumference is simply more universally acceptable.
That makes total sense.
However, for it to be medically valid, it requires strict, unyielding standardization.
Right. So if you're a clinician or a medical assistant listening to this, think about your intake process. Are you just throwing a paper tape measure loosely around a patient's belly button over their clothes? Because if you are, this textbook data tells us your risk assessments are fundamentally flawed.
They are completely flawed. The protocol is rigid. It must be measured with a non-stretchable tape measure on bare skin.
Bare skin, okay.
Yes, in a perfectly horizontal plane, exactly halfway between the lowest palpable rib, the lower rib cage, and the top of the iliac crest measured in the mid-axillary line. And the measurement must be taken at the end of a normal expiration.
Any deviation from that?
Any deviation from that protocol renders the data essentially useless for tracking metabolic risk over time.
Which brings up the International Diabetes Federation, or IDF, criteria for metabolic syndrome. When they define this syndrome, which clusters dyslipidemia, hypertension, dysglycemia, and abdominal obesity, they realized they couldn't just pick one waist measurement and apply it to the whole world, could they?
They absolutely could not, because human populations have profoundly different genetic susceptibilities to visceral fat deposition.
Right.
Different ethnic groups partition their fat differently. For example, the threshold for dangerous abdominal obesity in a European male is a waist circumference of 94 centimeters or more.
Okay, 94.
But for a South Asian or Chinese male, that threshold drops significantly to 90 centimeters. And for Japanese men, it's even lower at 85 centimeters.
Let me test my understanding of the clinical implication here. Are you saying an Asian individual could have a completely normal BMI, maybe a 23 or 24, but if they carry their mass centrally, their physical risk for developing type 2 diabetes and hypertension is already unacceptably high?
That is precisely what the data shows, which is why the WHO Asian BMI cutoff for the overweight category was actually lowered to 23.
Oh, wow.
It highlights the fatal flaw of relying on a one-size-fits-all metric like a BMI of 25. But this geographical distribution of fat raises a really critical developmental question.
What's that?
If abdominal fat is so lethal in adults, how do we track this risk as it is forming? How do we even define or measure obesity in a growing child whose skeletal height and mass are constantly naturally fluctuating?
Right, because you clearly can't just apply an adult BMI of 25 to a 7-year-old. A 7-year-old is actively building their bone density and muscular structure. Their proportions are entirely different.
Historically, pediatric obesity was a massive epidemiological blind spot.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Early reference data for child growth predominantly came from the United States, but it was heavily skewed. It was based largely on affluent bottle-fed babies from a very specific era.
So it wasn't a representative baseline at all.
Not at all. Eventually, the International Obesity Task Force, the IOTF, developed a clever statistical system. They created pediatric growth curves that linked childhood percentiles directly to the adult BMI cutoffs of 25 and 30.
How does that work?
Basically, they tracked which specific growth trajectory at, say, age 5 or 10 statistically guaranteed hitting a BMI of 25 by age 18.
That is clever. But the real breakthrough, the complete paradigm shift in how we understand the true biological baseline of human growth, came from a massive World Health Organization study published in 2007.
Yes, the 2007 WHO Multicenter Growth Reference Study. It is honestly one of the most elegant pieces of public health research ever conducted.
I mean, they didn't just look at one country or one ethnicity, did they?
No. They monitored children in Davis, California, Oslo, Norway, New Delhi, India, Muscat, Oman, Accra, Ghana, and Pelotas, Brazil.
A truly global sample.
But the absolute genius was in their inclusion criteria. They isolated the optimal environmental conditions. These had to be healthy babies delivered at full term from non-smoking mothers who were exclusively breastfed for at least 4 months.
Right.
With absolutely no environmental constraints on growth.
So they essentially stripped away poverty, malnutrition, and toxins to see what the human biological default actually looks like.
Yes. And the result was breathtaking in its clarity. Regardless of their ethnic background, whether that baby was born to Norwegian parents in Oslo or Indian parents in New Delhi, under optimal environmental conditions, healthy infant skeletal and mass growth is almost universally identical.
Universally identical.
Yes. The variability between the different ethnic groups was tiny compared to the variability within the groups themselves.
That is profound. The implication there is massive. It means that the extreme differences we see in adult body shapes and the wildly divergent obesity rates across different countries are not hardwired into us from birth.
No, they aren't.
We all start with the exact same biological blueprint for growth. But if every human baby effectively starts on the same path, when does the divergence happen? When do we start to see this problem track into the future?
So the epidemiological data on tracking, which is the persistence of a physical trait over time, is where the public health alarm bells become absolutely deafening. Children are rarely born obese, but once they hit about 5 years of age, the trajectory starts to lock in.
Age 5, that early.
Yes. If a child is overweight at age 5, they carry at least a 40% risk of that overweight or obesity persisting directly into their adult life. And by the time they reach their mid-teens, if they are obese, that risk skyrockets to between 60 and 75%.
It's exactly like a compounding interest problem, but instead of wealth, we are talking about compounding metabolic damage. Think about earlier generations, maybe our parents or grandparents. If they gained weight, it usually happened in their 40s or 50s. Their vascular endothelium, their pancreatic beta cells, their joints, those systems had decades of relatively healthy, lean functioning before the metabolic stress of obesity hit them.
Right, they had a buffer.
But today's youth are starting heavy. A 15-year-old who is already clinically obese has decades of physiological exposure ahead of them. Their lifetime cumulative exposure to hyperinsulinemia, to sheer mechanical joint stress, to systemic inflammation is completely unprecedented in human evolutionary history.
And that earlier onset fundamentally alters the macroeconomic timeline. It means the severe disability and morbidity associated with obesity will hit these individuals in their 30s and 40s.
Right, during their prime.
Exactly, during what should be their peak economic and social productive years. It accelerates the entire burden of disease.
So, if infant growth under optimal conditions is identical across the globe, but tracking shows us that the trajectory locks in during early childhood, what is the actual trigger? Why do some people living in the exact same neighborhood, eating from the exact same grocery store, gain weight so much faster than others? This brings us to the most fiercely debated topic in the field, the genetic landscape.
The genetics argument is omnipresent in clinical practice. Patients frequently attribute their weight entirely to their family history, and, there is undeniable genetic involvement.
Sure.
Massive genome-wide association studies have identified common variants, most notably in the FTO gene, which stands for fat mass and obesity associated gene, and the MC4R genes.
Yeah.
To give you an idea of the scale, about 16% of adults are homozygous for the FTO risk allele.
Okay, homozygous meaning they inherited the specific risk variant of that gene from both their mother and their father. What does having two copies of that gene actually do to them biologically?
Having that homozygous FTO trait actively alters the function of the hypothalamus in the brain. It adds, on average, about 3 kilograms of body weight and confers a 1.67-fold increased odds of clinical obesity.
Just from that one gene.
Yes. And crucially, this genetic influence is often evident phenotypically from as early as 7 years of age. Mechanistically, it seems to operate largely through an altered increased appetite and a reduced sensitivity to satiety signals. They physically feel hungrier.
And when we talk about why a gene like that even exists, evolutionary biologists always point to the thrifty gene hypothesis, right? James Neal proposed this back in 1962.
Right, the classic thrifty gene.
The concept is that early human evolution was defined by constant, brutal threats of famine. So natural selection aggressively favored individuals whose metabolisms were highly efficient at storing any extra calories as fat during rare times of plenty. That biological hoarding allowed them to survive the inevitable famines that killed off their leaner peers.
It's a very elegant, compelling narrative for why our bodies are so fiercely protective of stored fat and why weight loss is biologically resisted. But if we analyze this from a broader population genetics perspective, identifying a single specific gene cluster as the sole culprit for the current epidemic is deeply problematic.
How so?
Well, historically, severe famines affected the evolution of almost all human societies globally, yet obesity prevalence varies wildly from country to country today.
But wait, let's look at the timeline, because this is where the pure genetics argument falls apart for me entirely. You hear people say, obesity runs in my family, it's just my genetics. But the global prevalence of obesity has skyrocketed exponentially in just the last 40 years.
Exactly.
The human gene pool does not mutate that fast. We haven't evolved an entirely new set of metabolic genes since the 1980s.
That is the ultimate counter-argument. Genetics alone cannot possibly explain the sudden, explosive global rise in BMI. The conceptual framework we must adopt is one of exposure versus outcome.
Right.
Genes simply load the gun. The modern obesogenic environment pulls the trigger.
I love that phrasing. How does that actually play out in a population data set, though?
The legendary epidemiologist Jeffrey Rose highlighted this beautifully back in 1991. He demonstrated that as the average BMI of a whole population begins to rise due to environmental factors, the statistical distribution of BMI within that population doesn't just shift uniformly to the right.
It doesn't.
No, it becomes increasingly skewed. The tail of the curve elongates. The individuals who shoot up into the highest, most extreme BMI ranges, the severely obese category, they are the ones harboring that genetic susceptibility, like the FTO variants.
So their genetics were always there, but they were essentially dormant. In a food-scarce environment in the 1940s, those genetic differences wouldn't be visibly obvious because there simply weren't enough excess calories to trigger the hoarding mechanism.
Precisely.
But in our modern environment, those with the genetic susceptibility act as hyper-responders. The environment pushes everyone's weight up slightly, but it pushes the genetically susceptible into severe obesity.
That's exactly it. Their genetic vulnerability is only unmasked by the environmental exposure, which means we have to rigorously examine how that environment is shifting globally, because this is no longer just a high-income Western problem.
Right, let's track the global epidemiology. We are witnessing what researcher Barry Popkin defined as the nutrition transition. And this transition is being driven by the relentless engines of rapid economic development and massive, unprecedented urbanization.
The systems thinking required here is fascinating. If we track the socioeconomic gradient of obesity as a nation's economy develops, we see a very distinct, predictable pattern.
What's a pattern?
In very poor developing communities, the first demographic to begin gaining excess weight is almost always middle-aged women. Then, as the national economy develops, infrastructure improves, and the gross domestic product starts to rise, the average BMI of the entire population begins to rise. In these developing societies, the most affluent people actually have the highest obesity rates.
Because they are the first ones who can afford to buy motorized transport, escaping manual labor, and they are the first who can afford to purchase heavily processed, calorie-dense foods. Wealth, in a developing nation, initially equals weight gain.
Yes, but only up to a very specific tipping point. The data shows that the average population BMI peaks when a country reaches a gross domestic product of roughly $15,000 to $17,000 per capita.
Wow, that's specific.
It is. Once a society crosses that economic threshold and transitions into a highly affluent, high-income nation, a massive, complete reversal occurs in the epidemiology.
The socioeconomic gradient literally flips upside down.
It does. In high-income nations like the US, the UK, or Australia, the wealthiest demographics become the slimmest, and the poorest, most marginalized populations suffer the highest, most severe obesity rates.
Right.
The wealthiest have the financial resources, the higher education, and the built environment like safe, walkable neighborhoods and access to fresh produce to actively resist the obesogenic forces. Meanwhile, the poorest are geographically and economically bombarded by cheap, ultra-processed, energy-dense calories.
And this transition creates an unbelievable systemic health equity crisis globally. The textbook data highlights this starkly. Listen to this. Only 16% of total global health expenditure occurs in non-OECD countries, the poorer, developing nations.
Just as 16%.
Yet, because of this rapid nutrition transition, those exact same countries now carry 80% of the world's non-communicable disease burden. They have 80% of the cardiovascular disease, the type 2 diabetes, the obesity-driven cancers, but only 16% of the money to treat it.
It represents an impending catastrophic healthcare collapse for those nations. They are facing a dual burden. They're still fighting infectious diseases and undernutrition in some regions, while simultaneously being crushed by the chronic diseases of overnutrition in their urban centers.
It's devastating.
Which brings us to the actual clinical hazards. What exactly is this excess mass doing to the human body and, by extension, to the global economy?
The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, the IHME, published massive global burden of disease data in 2010. And when you read the list, it's not just about an increased risk of heart attacks. The cascading physical impacts across every organ system are staggering.
The clinical list is brutally extensive. We see severe respiratory impairment. Just the mechanical burden of carrying excess weight is exhausting. Obese adults walking at a normal pace can use up to 60% of their maximum exercise capacity just moving their own mass.
60%, just walking.
Yes. That inherently leads to profound, unavoidable physical inactivity because movement is genuinely arduous. We see crippling osteoarthritis, specifically in the weight-bearing joints like knees and hips, leading to chronic back and joint pain.
And sleep apnea. I really don't think the general public understands how devastating obstructive sleep apnea is systemically. It's treated like a snoring problem, but it's actually a cardiovascular nightmare.
It is highly destructive pathophysiology. Due to the weight of the adipose tissue around the neck and airway, subjects literally stop breathing for a quarter or half a minute at a time, dozens of times a night.
They just stop breathing.
Exactly. This leads to repeated episodes of severe hypoxia, a dangerous drop in blood oxygen. Every time oxygen drops, the brain panics and persistently triggers the sympathetic nervous system. It floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol, the fight-or-flight response, all night long.
So the patient thinks they're sleeping, but their cardiovascular system is running a marathon in a state of sheer panic.
Exactly. This nocturnal sympathetic overdrive causes severe drug-resistant hypertension. It massively amplifies the risk of cardiovascular mortality, stroke, and arrhythmias.
Right.
Furthermore, because their sleep architecture is completely destroyed, they suffer from profound daytime somnolence. Abdominally obese adults with thick necks literally fall asleep at the wheel, causing a significant spike in fatal traffic accidents.
And beyond the vascular issues, the IHME data also pointed to massive spikes in certain cancers: esophageal, colorectal, pancreatic, kidney, and postmenopausal breast cancer. The physical toll on the human body is immense. But let's pivot from the clinical reality to the societal impact.
Okay, let's look at the economics.
Why are politicians, who usually ignore long-term health trends, suddenly caring so much about this? Why is obesity increasingly hitting the desks of finance ministers and prime ministers?
Because of dailies and dollars.
Easily.
Dailies are disability-adjusted life years. It is a vital public health metric that combines years of life lost to premature death with years of healthy, productive life lost to severe disability. Politicians and finance ministers care because obesity is incredibly unsustainably expensive. To understand the economic threat, we have to differentiate between direct costs and indirect costs.
Right, direct costs are the obvious line items on a healthcare budget. Hospital beds, surgical interventions, doctor visits, prescription medications. The data shows that obese patients in the U.S. incur 80% higher spending on prescription medications alone compared to normal weight individuals.
Yes, the direct medical costs are vast. But the true macroeconomic terror lies in the indirect costs, which are typically several times larger than the direct medical
So
costs.
several times larger.
Easily. This is where we account for massive losses in workforce productivity, early forced retirement due to physical breakdown, the burden of disability pensions, and a crucial occupational health concept called presenteeism.
Presenteeism, I want to linger on that. It's the opposite of absenteeism. It means the employee is physically present at their desk, but they aren't fully productive because they are battling chronic back pain, or they are exhausted from sleep apnea, or they are dealing with clinical depression linked to their declining physical health.
That is exactly it. They are at work, but their output is severely compromised. Economic research shows that presenteeism among very obese men amounts to the equivalent of losing an entire month of productivity every single year per person.
An entire month.
Yes. When you scale that across a national workforce, that is a staggering multi-billion-dollar loss of economic output. To put a number on it, the UK Foresight Tackling Obesity's report, a landmark modeling project, projected that the ongoing rise in obesity will add £5.5 billion in direct medical costs to the National Health Service by 2050, and the wider cost to society will be exponentially higher.
The takeaway here is profound. Obesity isn't just a health sector issue anymore. It's not just a problem for doctors. It's a primary macroeconomic threat. It directly threatens the long-term solvency of national healthcare systems and the baseline productivity of the global workforce.
And we must recognize that this economic and physical threat is not distributed equally across all ethnic groups. This brings us back to something we touched on earlier regarding Asian and Mexican populations.
Right.
We noted that they face a 2 to 5-fold greater risk for developing central adiposity, type 2 diabetes, and hypertension at much lower BMIs compared to Caucasian populations.
Right, and we established that we can't just wave our hands and say it's genetics because genes don't act alone. So what is the biological mechanism driving this acute vulnerability in specific populations?
This is where we must introduce the Barker hypothesis, also known as the developmental origins of health and disease. This represents a crucial paradigm shift in public health thinking.
Okay, tell us about Barker.
The hypothesis suggests that environmental factors acting during critical periods of fetal development, specifically poor maternal nutrition resulting in low birth weight, permanently program the fetus's metabolism in utero.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the mechanics of this. If a fetus is developing inside a mother who is malnourished, the developing fetal metabolic system effectively senses that deprivation and says, okay, the world I am about to be born into is starving. I need to adapt my organs right now to build a metabolism that is hyper-efficient at hoarding every single calorie I eventually find.
That is precisely the biological logic. It creates what we call a thrifty phenotype. The fetus literally alters its organ structure. For example, it may develop a smaller total mass of insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas.
Because why build a massive insulin factory if you never expect to encounter large amounts of glucose?
Exactly. A specific, profound example of this epigenetic programming was observed in the Pune maternal nutrition study in India. They tracked pregnant women who were highly deficient in vitamin B12, but who were simultaneously being supplemented with folic acid.
Wait, giving folic acid is a standard, very common public health intervention globally to prevent neural tube defects. What happens when you mix high folate with low B12?
In the presence of B12 deficiency, this highly specific, unbalanced nutritional profile produced babies that were small at birth, they had low birth weight, but they were highly prone to developing central abdominal adiposity and severe insulin resistance that became clinically evident even in later childhood.
But how? How does a vitamin imbalance in the mother actually change the baby's future body shape? What is the physical mechanism?
It comes down to epigenetics, specifically the methylation of the promoter regions of the child's DNA.
Methylation.
Yes, imagine DNA as an instruction manual. Methyl groups act like physical molecular padlocks that attach to the DNA strand. They don't change the genetic letters, but they physically block the cellular machinery from reading specific genes.
Oh, I see.
The maternal nutritional imbalance caused abnormal methylation patterns in the fetus, permanently silencing certain metabolic genes and overactivating others. It altered their metabolic destiny before they took their first breath.
That is a staggering, tragic irony. Historical malnutrition or specific maternal micronutrient deficiencies actually primes a population to be uniquely devastated by the sudden arrival of Western fast food.
Yes.
It is a cross-generational metabolic trap. The mother's deprivation in the past biologically guarantees the child's obesity, in the present obesogenic environment.
And it creates a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle because now those women who were born with low birth weight are surviving, entering their own reproductive years, and becoming pregnant while they are overweight or obese.
And what does that do to the next generation?
We know that maternal obesity and gestational diabetes flood the developing fetus with excess glucose and insulin, which epigenetically programs the next generation for an even greater risk of macrosomia and lifelong obesity. We are compounding the error across generations.
Okay, so if we zoom out, we are looking at a massive, complex, intergenerational macroeconomic crisis that is biologically self-perpetuating. If you are a policymaker or a minister of health, how do you even begin to figure out what to do? You can't just enact a massive tax policy on a whole country and wait 40 years to see if the Barker hypothesis plays out favorably.
You cannot. And that is exactly where dynamic modeling becomes the most powerful tool in public health. We have to simulate the future mathematically to test policies before we implement them.
How do you simulate a whole population?
There are different ways to do this. There are Markov cohort models, which simulate a large hypothetical cohort of people moving through different defined health states, like healthy, obese, diabetic, dead over time based on transition probabilities. But for complex chronic diseases, more advanced public health teams rely on microsimulations, like the sophisticated model developed by the UK Health Forum for the Foresight Report.
Why are microsimulations necessary? Why isn't a standard Markov model good enough for predicting obesity outcomes?
Because a standard Markov model is generally memoryless. It just looks at what state a group is in right now and applies a probability for where they go next. But human biology has a memory.
Right.
A microsimulation is vastly superior because instead of moving a whole anonymous block of people together, it tracks hundreds of thousands of individual heterogeneous simulated agents over time.
It tracks simulated individuals.
Yes. It allows an individual simulated patient's unique history, their specific age, their sex, their 15-year history of smoking, their previous weight cyclings to dynamically impact their future progression. It's exponentially more accurate for modeling chronic, lifelong diseases. These microsimulations have now been run in over 70 countries to guide policy.
And when you run those massive simulations, what they reveal is a truth that is incredibly counterintuitive, especially for politicians who are looking for quick wins.
Yes, the data clashes hard with political instincts. Politically, preventing childhood obesity is incredibly popular. It's an easy sell. No one blames a child, and everyone wants to fund programs to help kids eat better.
Sure.
But the microsimulations show that while childhood prevention is absolutely vital for the 50-year health of a nation, it yields almost negligible economic returns over the next 10 to 40 years.
Because the 8-year-olds aren't the ones currently having massive, expensive myocardial infarctions. They aren't the ones needing 15,000-pound knee replacements or going on long-term disability pensions. They won't hit the healthcare system with those massive structural costs for another 3 or 4 decades.
Exactly. If a government is looking at the modeling and wants the fastest, most potent return on investment to save their healthcare system from imminent bankruptcy, the simulations show they must focus their interventions on reducing weight in adults.
Adults, really?
Specifically, the highest economic leverage comes from targeting adults over 18, and particularly those under 50 who are currently in the high-risk categories, those who have prediabetes or incipient hypertension. Preventing that specific cohort from converting into full-blown, irreversible type 2 diabetes yields massive immediate cost savings that can stabilize a health budget.
And the models also show the incredible power of small, population-wide shifts. If a government could achieve just a tiny population-level shift, say a 4 BMI unit average reduction across the entire adult population, it would radically alter global health economics. The entire burden of chronic disease would plummet.
But we must acknowledge the sobering historical reality of that projection. We have only ever seen a population-wide BMI reduction of that scale once in modern recorded history.
Just once.
Yes. And that was during Cuba's severe financial crisis in the early 1990s, known as the Special Period. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost its subsidized fuel and food imports. It triggered severe, widespread food deprivation and a forced reliance on walking and manual bicycles due to a total lack of gasoline.
So they achieved the 4 BMI unit drop, and their cardiovascular disease rates plummeted. But it wasn't a public health victory. It was the result of a devastating macroeconomic collapse and near starvation.
Precisely, which highlights just how incredibly difficult it is to reverse this trend once it is established at a population level. We are obviously not going to intentionally induce famine or economic collapse to cure obesity, so we have to look incredibly closely at the daily mathematics of how the weight is gained in the first place so we can stop it from accumulating.
Okay.
This brings us to the concept of the energy gap.
Okay, let's look at the math because this is the paradox that completely blew my mind when I read the chapter. The average adult in a Western environment gains about zero point 0.5 to 1.0 kilograms of body weight per year over their adult life. That insidious slow creep. But when you calculate the actual caloric value of that 1 kilogram of fat and you divide it by 365 days, what does it equate to on a daily basis?
It equates to a positive energy gap, a daily discrepancy between the calories a person consumes and the calories they burn of merely 10 to 20 kilocalories per day.
Wait, I need to pause here because that sounds absurd. 10 to 20 calories. That is literally half a bite of an apple. That's a single sip of a sugary soda. That's leaving one single French fry on your plate. Are you telling me that this entire catastrophic global health crisis, costing billions of pounds and millions of lives, is driven by a daily biological error margin of 20 calories?
It is.
How can our bodies be so incredibly, unbelievably precise in regulating our energy, yet fail so universally across the globe?
That is the ultimate biological paradox of obesity. An error of 10 to 20 calories represents less than 1% of a normal adult's daily caloric intake. From a purely physiological perspective, it actually demonstrates how miraculously precise our internal homeostatic regulation is, that it's only off by less than 1% every day.
That's a good point.
The human body is a thermodynamic marvel. But to understand why that 1% error is now consistently, universally off in the positive direction causing weight gain, we have to look at how the modern environment has fundamentally warped both sides of the energy equation, output and input.
Okay, let's start with output. On the output side, we have the collapse of physical activity.
Right.
We have systematically, over decades, engineered physical movement out of human existence. We transitioned from agricultural labor to manufacturing, and now to entirely sedentary desk jobs. We drive cars instead of walking.
The obvious thermodynamic principles apply. We are burning fewer calories. But the public health focus isn't just about encouraging people to go to the gym for 30 minutes. It's about a concept called non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT.
NEAT.
Yes. NEAT is the energy expended for everything we do that is not sleeping, eating, or sports-like exercise. It's the spontaneous movement of daily life fidgeting, standing up, pacing while on the phone, walking to the bus. Levine demonstrated the profound impact of NEAT beautifully in a study comparing rural and urban adults in Jamaica, comparing them to obese adults in the United States.
If I remember correctly, the baseline structured exercise wasn't the deciding factor, was it?
Not at all. The urban thin adults in both Jamaica and the U.S. had very similar levels of formal structured activity. But the rural Jamaicans spent 60% more of their day simply walking and standing as part of their necessary daily routines.
It's 2% more.
Meanwhile, the obese American cohort sat for almost 4 full hours longer per day than the rural Jamaicans. When you transition a society into an environment that requires prolonged, inescapable sitting, you instantly drop the daily baseline energy expenditure by hundreds of calories. The 20-calorie positive gap becomes mathematically inevitable.
But the old adage is true. You cannot outwalk a fundamentally bad diet. Even if we stood at our desks all day, we have to look at the input side of the equation. We have to look at the dietary drivers, which means we have to look at agricultural economics.
Yes. Following the devastation of the Second World War, sweeping agricultural policies and vast government subsidies were established across the U.S. and Europe to generate ever more and ever cheaper food. The noble goal was to eliminate the specter of hunger and to make high-quality proteins like meat and dairy affordable for the working class. The problem is, the policies worked entirely too well. We created a massive structural caloric surplus on a global scale.
And when you have a massive surplus of cheap corn, soy, and sugar, the food industry, big food, has to figure out how to process and sell all of it to maximize profit. So they shifted away from whole foods to creating hyper-palatable, ultra-processed, incredibly energy-dense products. Foods that are entirely stripped of their natural fiber, which fills you up, and instead are scientifically engineered with specific, highly tested combinations of cheap fats, refined sugars, and salt.
And here is where we uncover the biological sabotage. These scientifically engineered products don't just provide passive calories, they actively trigger profound neurochemical responses. High sugar and high fat foods trigger a massive release of dopamine in the reward and pleasure centers of the human brain.
Right, the reward loop.
But, and this is a critical recent neurological finding, there is strong evidence showing that as individuals consume these foods and become obese, there is a physical downregulation of dopamine receptor density in those specific brain centers.
Let me make sure I understand the mechanics of downregulation.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying the actual physical receptors in the brain that register pleasure begin to disappear or become numb because they are being overstimulated by the junk food?
Yes, it is biologically identical to the tolerance developed in substance addiction. The brain protects itself from overstimulation by reducing the number of active receptors.
Wow.
Because of this downregulation, obese individuals physically require more food, a much stronger caloric stimulus, just to feel the exact same baseline level of pleasure or psychological satisfaction that a lean individual gets from a much smaller portion. The extreme energy density of the food, combined with its lack of fiber, completely bypasses our natural evolutionary stretch receptors in the stomach and our hormonal satiety signals. It leads to what researchers term passive overconsumption.
That reframing is essential. You aren't consciously choosing to overeat out of some moral failing or greed. Your neurobiology is actively being hijacked by the chemical composition and extreme density of the food itself. It takes a conscious, exhausting effort not to overeat in that environment.
Which totally and completely dismantles the willpower argument. And it leads us perfectly to the clinical reality of why dieting, which has been the primary medical tool we've relied on for decades, is so spectacularly, predictably ineffective over the long term.
Right. Why does profound weight loss almost always fail?
Because of the biological maintenance of obesity. The body fiercely defends its highest achieved weight. It treats any loss of fat as an absolute biological emergency. When you gain weight, the body effectively resets its regulatory system.
How so?
Let's say a patient gains 10 kilograms of fat over a decade. That extra tissue isn't dead weight, it is biologically active. It requires an additional 200 to 300 kilocalories a day just to maintain vascularization and cellular function. Your body adapts to that higher caloric intake as the new baseline normal.
I think the best way to conceptualize this for patients is the thermostat analogy.
Oh, I use that one all the time.
Right. Imagine the hypothalamus in your brain is a thermostat in a house. Normally, it's set to a comfortable 70 degrees. But over years of living in an obesogenic environment, eating hyperpalatable foods, that thermostat gets broken and slowly resets itself to 90 degrees. So the house, your body, gets incredibly hot, carrying all this extra weight. Now, if a patient tries to fix the problem just by opening a window, which represents going on a strict, calorie-restricted crash diet, the system doesn't say, oh good, the house is finally cooling down to a healthy temperature.
No, the thermostat senses the sudden temperature drop, panics because it thinks the target is 90, and blasts the furnace harder to compensate for the open window.
Exactly. That is exactly what happens neurobiologically. If an obese person tries to lose weight by consciously cutting calories, the brain's hypothalamus reacts within 2 to 4 days.
Days, not months, days.
It perceives the intentional diet as a life-threatening famine. It triggers an acute neurohormonal semi-starvation response. It drops leptin levels, spikes ghrelin to induce ravenous hunger, actively slashes thyroid hormone production to slow your basal metabolic rate, and turns down the autonomic nervous system to conserve as much energy as possible.
Even if that patient has 1 million extra calories safely stored in their adipose tissue,
The brain ignores it.
completely ignores the massive fuel reserves, and acts as if the organism is starving to death. The biological drive to eat becomes massively, overwhelmingly amplified. This is an evolutionary survival mechanism honed over millions of years that we are asking patients to fight against using only a printed diet pamphlet. People who successfully maintain profound weight loss have to treat it like a full-time, exhausting job, constantly monitoring every single bite, rigorously exercising 2,000 to 3,000 calories away a week, existing in a permanent state of biological hunger just to fight their own biology.
Let's connect this to the bigger societal picture. When you actually understand the endocrinology of that semi-starvation response, it makes the societal stigma and the medical bias against obesity not just cruel, but fundamentally scientifically illiterate. We are blaming individuals for failing to overcome millions of years of evolutionary survival programming.
It is deeply unethical to stigmatize patients for their biology. And from a public health standpoint, it underscores exactly why prevention is paramount. Treating established obesity is an uphill, often losing battle against human biology.
Because you can't fight the thermostat.
Right. Prevention keeps the biological thermostat from resetting to 90 degrees in the first place. And if individual willpower and dieting are effectively useless against an obesogenic environment, that means we have to look at upstream engineering and public policy.
We have to stop bailing water and fix the floodplain.
Exactly. To do that systematically, public health officials use frameworks like Angelo, the analysis grid for environments linked to obesity. Yes. This framework forces us to look at both the microenvironments, like the local school canteen or a specific neighborhood, and the macroenvironments, like national food subsidies, tax policy, and global urban planning. And when we look at interventions, we must strictly differentiate between two major approaches: educational or behavioral approaches versus structural or regulatory approaches.
Let me define those. Educational approaches are what we've done for 40 years. It's putting calorie counts on menus, handing out nutritional brochures, running TV campaigns telling people to eat more vegetables. It's putting the onus on the individual to make a better choice. Structural approaches change the default environment. It's changing what food is legally allowed to be sold, what it costs, and how the city is physically built.
And the economic data on what actually works is definitive. The OECD health economics data, rigorously analyzed by SASE in 2010, showed that mass media education campaigns and routine in-clinic physician counseling have almost zero cumulative impact on reducing daylights or lowering national health expenditure over time.
Because handing out a brochure doesn't work when the patient walks out of the clinic and back into a toxic, heavily marketed food environment. Education cannot compete with $1 billion marketing budget and dopamine hijacking food.
What does work, demonstrably, are fiscal and regulatory measures, structural interventions.
Like what?
Well, we have seen this clearly with the Danish saturated fat tax and the French tax on sugar-sweetened soft drinks, just basic economics. When governments raise the price of pathogenic products, population-level purchasing falls. Furthermore, the WHO strongly advocates that we must aggressively regulate the marketing of junk food, particularly advertising directed at children. Children do not have the cognitive defense mechanisms to resist sophisticated marketing, and they are highly price-sensitive.
But if you propose a tax on cheap, ultra-processed food or sugary drinks, the immediate aggressive pushback you always hear from the industry and some politicians is that taxing unhealthy food is fundamentally regressive. It hurts the poorest populations who rely on those cheap, dense calories just to survive on a tight budget.
And that is a mathematically valid economic concern. A simple, isolated tax on cheap food does disproportionately impact the discretionary income of lower-income households. That is why an isolated tax is a clumsy tool. It must be part of an integrated, comprehensive economic package. You cannot just use the stick. You must provide a structural carrot. The model public health looks to is Finland.
What exactly did the Finnish public health model do differently?
They engaged in true upstream engineering. They didn't just tax the bad, they structurally and financially subsidized the good. They enacted policies ensuring that the cost of healthy items, specifically vegetables and salads provided with main meals in massive communal settings, like school canteens, workplace cafeterias, and state institutions, was fully included in the heavily subsidized base price of the meal. They effectively made the healthy choice the cheapest, easiest, default choice.
Oh, instead of asking a stressed, low-income worker to pay an extra €3 for a side salad, the salad is already on the tray and paid for by the structural subsidy.
Exactly. And the results were phenomenal. Over a 15-year period, this comprehensive structural approach contributed to a massive trebling in the entire population's vegetable intake. That dietary shift led to a marked population-wide reduction in essential hypertension and a profound, measurable fall in cardiovascular disease mortality. They shifted the entire population's diet at the macro level without financially penalizing poverty.
That perfectly reinforces our overarching metaphor. We must stop placing the impossible burden of surviving a toxic environment entirely on individual willpower. We need to regulate big food, we need to tax big soda, and we urgently need to reform those post-WWII agricultural subsidies so that the global food supply actually aligns with human biological needs rather than just maximizing corporate caloric output.
Prevention of chronic disease requires structural legislative change at the highest government levels. We simply cannot educate our way out of an obesogenic environment.
We've covered an incredible amount of ground today. From the actuarial tables of metropolitan life, through the J-shaped curves of epidemiology, into the fetal epigenetic programming of the Barker hypothesis, the neurological hijacking of our dopamine receptors, and finally to the massive macroeconomic threat facing our global health systems. But as we wrap up this deep dive into Chapter 8.4, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over. If our built environment and our global food supply are currently structurally engineered to make us sick by default, at what point does the concept of personal responsibility become entirely scientifically obsolete for public health? Think about it. We would never blame a child for developing asthma from breathing polluted city air. We don't hand them a brochure on how to breathe better. We regulate the factories pumping out the smog. So why, when the biological and epidemiological science is this overwhelmingly clear, do we continue to blame individuals for consuming a polluted food supply?
That is the essential defining question for the next generation of public health leaders. Now, to cement the conceptual frameworks we've built today, let's run through 5 rapid-fire single best answer recall prompts. Use these to test your active clinical reasoning. I will state the question, pause briefly for you to formulate your answer, and then provide the solution and the specific textbook reference section. Question 1. Which physical measurement is preferred globally for assessing the metabolic and cardiovascular risk associated with abdominal adiposity due to its cultural acceptability and clinical ease of use? Answer. Waist circumference, measured exactly halfway between the lower rib cage and the iliac crest. Reference. Revisit the section. Other criteria for classifying excess weight gain in Chapter 8.4. Question 2. According to the Barker hypothesis of developmental origins, what specific early life environmental exposure significantly amplifies a patient's risk of developing abdominal obesity and type 2 diabetes in later adult life? Answer. Poor fetal nutrition resulting in low birth weight, leading to a thrifty phenotype. Reference. Revisit the section, Ethnic Differences in Susceptibility to Chronic Diseases. Question 3. The average adult weight gain of 0.5 to 1.4 kilograms per year represents a daily positive energy gap of approximately how many kilocalories? Answer. A mere 10 to 20 kilocalories per day. Reference. Revisit the section, Small Errors in Energy Balance. Question 4. Based on massive OECD economic modeling, which obesity prevention strategy has been shown to have the least impact on reducing disability-adjusted life years, or DELIAs, over time? Answer. Educational mass media campaigns and routine physician counseling. Reference. Revisit the section, Approaches to Prevention. Question 5. Physiologically, why is profound intentional weight loss so incredibly difficult for a patient to maintain over the long term? Answer. Because the hypothalamus initiates an acute neurohormonal semi-starvation response within days, lowering metabolic rate and actively resisting further fat loss. Reference. Revisit the section, The Biological as well as Societal Maintenance of Obesity.
Here are the details of this episode.
Obesity. Episode description. Obesity is one of the defining public health challenges of the 21st century. Once concentrated in high-income nations, it now affects populations across all income levels and regions, contributing substantially to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and musculoskeletal disorders. This episode examines global trends and epidemiological transition. This episode examines body mass index, BMI, and its limitations. This episode examines biological regulation of appetite and metabolism. This episode examines energy balance and environmental drivers. This episode examines the role of ultra-processed foods. This episode examines urban design and physical inactivity. This episode examines social gradients and food insecurity. This episode examines childhood obesity and life course risk. This episode examines policy interventions, taxation, marketing regulation, reformulation. This episode examines obesity cannot be reduced to individual willpower. It reflects an obesogenic environment in which calorie-dense foods are cheap, heavily marketed, and structurally embedded in daily life, while opportunities for physical activity may be constrained by design. This episode examines. The episode explores the interaction between genetics, behavior, environment, and socioeconomic inequality. It also addresses the tension between public health messaging and stigma, recognizing the ethical imperative to promote health without reinforcing discrimination. This episode examines. Prevention requires structural change as much as behavioral support. This episode examines. Key takeaways. This episode examines. Obesity is a global and growing public health issue. This episode examines. It significantly increases risk for multiple chronic diseases. This episode examines. Environmental and policy determinants strongly influence prevalence. This episode examines. Childhood obesity predicts adult morbidity. This episode examines. Structural interventions are often more effective than individual advice alone. This episode examines. A stigma undermines effective public health approaches. This episode examines. Prevention must operate across the life course.